Hey, it's Maria with another episode of the Everyday Heroine. Today we have Patricia Damon as our guest on the show. Hey, Trish.
Hi, it's so great to be here.
You have been invited to the show because you are an everyday heroine. Trish is a highly successful entrepreneur, CEO, president, and executive coach. Trish leads others toward their own rediscovery of their wholeness. I first saw Trish in the Revealed film series Psychedelics Revealed, which led to our connection while you were in Costa Rica. And then I saw the movie River Runner, which you were in. Plus, you are credited as an executive producer of the film. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
What would you like to share about your story with the audience?
Well, this is a bit of a unique story, although I think that we're at a time and place where all of us have universal trauma that we are experiencing collectively. But my story really began in my healing about 5 years ago. And it was a story of at the age of 16, I became pregnant. And I was raised Mormon, very traditional Mormon family, baby of 9 kids. And when I became pregnant, I felt like my only option was to go and have an abortion and hide this incidents that had happened, of course, within the Mormon culture. This was not really acceptable. And so I had told one girlfriend in high school who ended up telling my parents, and my parents showed up and had my bags packed and shipped me off to an all-girls school in Provo, Utah. At the time we were living in California. And it was just kind of known that I would have this baby and give him up for adoption and then come back to life as I knew it with my family. And, I think many things within the culture are to kind of conceal any perceived irreverent sins, specifically around young women. And so as it became closer to give birth to my son, I pleaded with my parents to kind of come back home and give birth to him. And after some time, they finally acquiesced, and I went back to California. And my delivery with him was very, very complicated, and they had to rush me into emergency surgery afterwards. And when I came out of surgery, there was a family there holding my son, ready to walk out the door with him. And of course, as a young mother and a mother in general, I kind of went into hysterics and wanted to understand my rights, and had enough wherewithal at that age to kind of advocate for myself, and was able to speak with a hospital counselor. And she, identified for me that at that point I was legally emancipated and I could keep him. And so I ended up keeping my son and, going to school and being a young mother. And at 9 months old, my parents wanted me to go see the bishop of the church. And so I went to go see him. And in this tearful exchange, he shared with me that he had this vision from God, and that God had told him that my child was no longer supposed to be with me on this earth. And so at 9 months old, they ended up adopting out my son. And my son came back to live with me when he turned 18. And all of a sudden, my trauma, which I did not have awareness around, was sitting in my living room. And although I had waited for this moment my whole life to embrace my child, to be reunited with him again as his mother, all of a sudden I started having post-traumatic flashbacks of childhood, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. And as we know, and I'm sure you know, Maria, as well, is that oftentimes when we go through childhood abuse, we disassociate from those memories, and we wear a mask in our adult life in order to cope with what's happened. And for me, my coping mechanism undoubtedly was perfectionism and success. And so the more successful I was, the more poised and put together I was, of course, I could just move through life without really dealing with some of these childhood instances that had happened. And so it was really at this time where I felt like it, oftentimes we see in life a traumatic event in our adult life neurologically cracks us open to our younger childhood trauma that we haven't really resolved. And as I say, oftentimes, people will refer to it as a life crisis or coming undone. And I always believe it's our really cracking open. It's our ability to go in and really do the deep dive and healing and work. And it was, I found myself on the bedroom of my floor at 2:00 in the morning one night, pleading with God, whom I didn't have a very strong connection with at the time, and not really sure how I felt about all of it, but pleading nevertheless of, show me a path to healing or take my life. I mean, that's really where I was at, because life as I knew it, all of a sudden in an instant had changed. And here I was being flooded with childhood memories and nightmares, and really didn't understand what was happening to me, and felt like on one hand I was kind of going crazy. And it was really then a few years ago that I started to find my path to healing.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a pretty intense story.
Yeah.
I love the cracking open. So what stands out to me too is, as you told the story, and it's very deep and intense. I appreciate your vulnerability. I can't imagine someone in the position of a pastor or a priest, kind of having this interaction with you. And it sounds like almost there was a cracking open even in that moment, but you were so young.
Yeah.
And then it sounds like you had another cracking open later in life that almost brought all of this stuff back for you.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I don't, and I love the self-inquiry as you say that. I don't know in that moment for me if when he had this revelation, I've often reflected in my adult life, and since I've gone on this healing journey of, why wasn't God tapping my shoulder and telling me that that was my truth? Why was this coming through someone outside of me? And I think so much in these organized religions, and I want to be very clear, this isn't to put the religion down, because it's just a byproduct of, kind of our cultural upbringing, right? But I feel like we're often taught in society that the answers are outside ourselves, or when we are in these patriarchal systems, it's that someone superior to us has the answers or wisdom, or even God's spirit, what have you, that we don't have this internal knowing. And I think at that point, I had been so conditioned that, yes, this person of authority has answers that are perhaps outside of me. And so I think as I relate to it, when you say to it, I feel like that aspect was really when I shut down and locked down. That wasn't the time when I cracked open. It was really when the world became very insular, and I created all of these guises to protect me from feeling the intensity of emotion that one might feel when having their baby at 9 months old, who they've attached to and bonded with and breastfed, taken. The pain of that, the only way for us to cope is to shut down and to become almost numb. And I look back on it now, and as I started my healing journey, I used to pride myself in my 20s and 30s that I never cried. And then when I started healing and all this emotion starts coming up, and you're like, where has this been? I'm not even familiar with tears or emotion. And yet, without experiencing the pain, we also can experience the joy. And so truly that cracking open in my early 40s was one of the greatest gifts that I could have been given, because all of a sudden it was like, this is what it feels like to be alive, to feel it all. For as painful and messy and, clumsy as the process may have been, it also was really incredible to go through.
Yeah. So a couple things you touch on there, being a woman in a male dominated industry and kind of understanding over what I'll say a long period of time, so I was, raised, I had two older brothers, and I guess I always, once again, kind of just put myself into some of these situations where it actually manifested also into a very lengthy and a very rewarding career. But a lot of
Sure.
times I was the only woman in the room. And I had that sense always that there was a system there, that I was looking for some of this feedback from outside of me.
Yeah, extra validation, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I kind of look back on it now as there was such criticism, always, the criticism in that sense that I didn't belong and that I wasn't wanted. And there was always this fighting that developed a very large perfectionism drive within myself. And I think that still speaks to a lot of women. I hear a lot of people talking about imposter syndrome these days. And I think whenever it gets pretty intense, I just love your feedback too, is just to kind of help people in those situations when there's kind of like this gaslighting, or there's these places that are trying to keep us small or limited. What can you say to our listeners to kind of help them in those situations? And maybe, they might be abusive. There's some pretty toxic environments out there, that women are working in, and kind of feeling like they're less than. Is there anything or insight that you can share with us on that?
Yeah, I think that's, exactly what was ringing through to me, this feeling of less than. And I think, for me, I also, one of my coping mechanisms and one of the things that I prided myself on was being stoic and being able to play in a man's world. Like, I almost tried to use that to my advantage. But I think there was always this undercurrent of, you will never be enough, you will never be an equal, there isn't place for that in kind of the male dominant roles. And so I think that, one of the things that I have learned in spades is this element of listening to that inner wisdom, that no one other than me knows what's best for me. And if I can get still enough and quiet enough to listen to that inner knowing and allow that to help infuse and inform my decision making. And that may be, is it staying within my position there, but being able to have influence by listening to my inner knowing? Is it by, moving into something work related that's of a higher consciousness or higher service to the world? I think that right now we all are being called forth to really live in our authentic truth and live in our, as I always say, and when I work with clients, when we're living in co-creation with that lights our soul on fire, we can't help but win. We can't help but win at the game of life when we're really in co-creation. For me, that inner wisdom, it's funny, I'm looking on my desk right now at the book, The Call, and it's really, what is our soul's calling? What is our soul's purpose that we're being called forth? And I think that, as long as we are staying true to ourselves, and if that is staying in their current role, then how can you not abandon yourself for that, or to the sacrifice of others? And so I think that's something that I really try to encourage women in having this relationship with our inner knowing.
Awesome. Perfect too. So what I've recently tried to introduce is just what I call just a practicing peace. And the whole idea on the practice of peace is whatever that may be, if it's meditation, if it's yoga, breath work, maybe it's just riding your bike, whatever that practice or habit is, you said it so beautifully, is a mechanism. I like to call it a mechanism to get you into that inner strength, to have that relationship with your inner self. Is there anything that you do on a regular basis to practice peace or to connect with
You
that
know
inner
what?
self?
It's interesting that you say that, because in my meditation this morning, as I was thinking, what is the bigger, what is the message that needs to come out? And peace was definitely at the forefront for me this morning. So, I think for me, the answers come in the stillness, in the quiet moments. I know for some, and that for me personally is through meditation, breath work, yoga, gentle walks, and such. I think also alone time is really when I have the ability to channel and get quiet and be able to listen, because we can fill our lives with the busyness. It almost becomes an addiction to be busy, and busyness equates to somehow being successful in our modern time. And I think that, COVID gave us all that reverent pause that we needed, and how uncomfortable that became for so many. I was alone during COVID, and I was like, yes, I love this. Look at all this space and time I get to create and to really be in that stillness. And I think that there's, something that's coming up for me is that when people start to drop into this work initially, or even meditation, there can be such discomfort. And so how do we learn to sit with the discomfort without reacting to it, and become that neutral observer of what's going on in the confines of our mind and our external world? And can we sit in that discomfort long enough to have the wisdom come through so we can get clarity on our best next steps?
That was so awesome. So
Yeah.
what I find interesting too is during COVID, I was listed as an essential employee. So I was still going to a manufacturing facility and doing an engineering capacity type of work.
Wow.
So I was still, not staying home, let's say. But what was interesting, I love the terms dropping in, because although I was going in, my commute was completely different. And it actually brought a sense of dropping in, or a sense of stillness, just in the difference.
Sure.
So it shows up different ways. And I know, a lot of, women in STEM, and, we do lead very, very distracted, very, very hectic lives. So it can be difficult to practice peace.
Absolutely. And I think, something that I want to make note of is that sometimes, doing a silent meditation for 20 minutes is completely daunting and overwhelming for some. And a lot of my clients that I work with, having them do guided meditations is kind of having that co-creation with something else, allowing something else to help them or guide them into that space. And I think that it's important for us to stay out of judgment with self and other in how that shows up for us, because for everyone it can be different. I'm also a musician. And so for me, when I sit down and I play the piano or violin, I can completely escape thought. It's like I can go into a deep meditative state just by being in that. And I think it's more so, can you dedicate time to whatever it is for you that creates that sense of coherence within our mental state and balance? And I think however that comes is brilliant for each and every one of us. And we're so unique, right? There aren't two ways, there are many ways for us to go about our spirituality and mindfulness.
Right. Thank you. Because, and that was, I wanted to, when I introduced it, I wanted to introduce it in a way that was hopefully hitting an inviting conversation for anyone. Because just like you said, everyone's different, and there's many different options out there.
Absolutely.
So what can you tell us about healing?
There's a lot I can share with you about healing. So when I really went on this path, and for so many, I was at a place of really feeling suicidal. I was overwhelmed by the emotion that was coming through. I tragically lost my sister and sister-in-law to sudden and tragic deaths. And really at that time, I was at this crossroads of needing support and needing a path to healing. And so in a very tearful exchange with the universe, really on my hands and knees asking for support, it came through to me of, what do I do? What is the path to healing? And in that quiet moment, it came through to me to go and explore psychedelics. And in my early 20s, I had tried psychedelics recreationally, kind of for fun, but I had not done anything therapeutically, and I had not done anything in several years in the realm of psychedelics. So I blindly went to the jungle and did my first quote unquote therapeutic psychedelic journey. And I will say that that journey undoubtedly saved my life. And I think what happens is, if we don't have the awareness of what is informing and influencing our behaviors, our negative patterns, if we don't have that awareness and we're unconsciously navigating in the world, how do we have something tangible that we can work with to heal and transmute into a different realm? And so I think psychedelics have this ability to take us back into our childhood memories with a compassionate lens for self and other, to really go back, relive it, transmute it, and then be able to neurologically rewire those traumatic pathways that have been etched for so many years. And some of it takes work. I would say that, I often tell clients that, the medicines of psychedelic medicines in particular, or let's say MDMA and, ketamine, that is also available, it's 20%. And then 80% is the integration and what we choose to do with it once we receive those messages and those insights. And I think that, as I was reflecting this morning as well, there's, people often ask me, how is it that you went through years of childhood physical, sexual, emotional abuse, losing a child, later on in my adult life was in a relationship with someone who was a sex addict for several years, and navigating that and being with a narcissist. And, I would say that it undoubtedly, having the discipline, for me, healing became my full-time job. Being disciplined to do the work, being dedicated to the path of healing, to then finally, and then having that full devotion that there's nothing I want more than my own emotional freedom. And so I think that when people ask, it's really a matter of having the courage to go back in, being with skilled providers that create safe space. I cannot emphasize that enough, because there's a lot of people, we're in the psychedelic renaissance right now, right? And we're starting to see, a lot of healers out there holding space, or, doing ceremonies and things like that. So finding skilled practitioners and or shamans to really guide your therapeutic process. And then I also cannot say enough about having skilled therapists or healers to work with once you come home and you receive some of this. So for me personally, a lot of my childhood memories I had disassociated from. So when I went and did my first therapeutic psychedelic experience, all of a sudden, the world as I knew it was completely cracked open. And there was a moment of flailing a little bit of, what do I do with this now that I've seen this? These people are still in my life. Now, what does my relationship mean to them? What is the relationship it is with myself? And I think, right now we're starting to see a lot of clinical psychologists start to do some work in, therapy and training around this as, psychedelics become more mainstream. And I will say that the powerful benefits of these medicines are life-changing, spiritually enriching, and can truly be the catalyst for healing. I was having a conversation with someone the other day. It's like those that have a PTSD diagnosis within 3 therapeutic treatments of MDMA can no longer meet that criteria. I mean, that's a game changer. When you look at, for me personally, I had been in therapy for over 20 years and still living out the same patterning, but not really understanding why. So again, to kind of bring that thought to completion, once we can have awareness and bring it into our consciousness, we now have something rich to work with, and we know what we're working towards in healing.
Wow. And I think one of the biggest wows, this story is always super powerful, but when you talk about the 80-20 rule there, and what I think I heard you say is that the psychedelics are basically 20% of, I want to say, the healing work. 80% is still an integration or a supportive environment and therapeutic method outside of the psychedelics. So 80-20, I mean, that's
Absolutely.
pretty huge. Like,
yeah, it is pretty huge because it's incumbent on us to do the work, right? And so I think I often see in the psychedelic space that people want to drop in and get the wisdom or get the insights. But then how do they integrate that into their everyday lifestyle? How do they take that wisdom and infuse it back into their family systems? And what do you do when you're doing the work, but your counterparts around you or your internal family systems aren't doing that work? And then all of a sudden we get back into that environment and we're being blasted with triggers. And how do we reach into the toolkit to kind of tether to some of these principles that we can use to really help us align and put some of these wisdoms into play, and also find that path of dedication? At times healing can be, as I've said, and I can speak for myself, very lonely, because you're kind of on this path on your own, and maybe your peers or friends or family aren't really completely on board. They don't understand what you're going through, and they don't understand the changes, albeit many positive. And so I think that if we can also find, and I talk a lot about this in some of the documentaries that I've done, it takes a village. And if I did not have a community kind of around me as I was going through some of my darkest hours, and, the, dark night, as I say, of the soul, of going back in and really getting to the underbelly of what was causing some of my behaviors, I don't know what I would have done. And so I think that's also something, whether it be working with someone like yourself, where, once they go and have this experience, who's helping them guide the process afterwards? So yes, the 2080 rule is paramount for me, for sure.
Yeah. I love hearing it because I believe it's true, and it's fascinating in many ways. Even on, there's that lonely aspect where it's, I think, once, psychedelics, at least for me, had this ability to expose this brilliant creative mind inside of my own, so once it kind of taps into this certain aspect, it almost makes loneliness a different concept to me now. It's like, how can anybody ever understand even, a sliver of some of that, just because it's very, very difficult to communicate, especially if you haven't, had the experiences. So
I am so curious. I have to ask, what does that loneliness mean to you now that you've done psychedelic work?
So what it means to me now, it's freedom. I mean, if I have to give it one word, it absolutely means freedom, because then it drops the expectation or the attachments and these other I lose the word sometimes, because we have these expectations sometimes as humans, like somebody's going to get me, somebody understands me. And on some level that is true, when we're in communities and we're all, women engineers, we all kind of get each other. We know that we're in a situation, very, very similar, but we're also very alone, and to the freedom of kind of dropping the expectation that somebody has to know me so well in this realm where it was an impossibility to ever achieve is a freedom,
And I think, something that's coming up for me right now as you're speaking about this is when we move into these medicines, we move into the world of the energetic, of the quantum field, and not to become, too woo-woo about it, but when we release control and we surrender to the process, and that's really what I'm hearing you say, the freedom comes in the surrender of letting go, of no longer having to be at the helm, no longer driving the bus. Now all of a sudden I get to go be a passenger and be in co-creative community with this energetic space and time and field, to where anything becomes possible. And I just see people come alive. It's like, if we're no longer living our lives by all these constructs and, uniformities that we thought were cultural, and societal norms to keep us safe or in our place, or, in our patriarchal systems, when all of that gets kind of washed away and anything becomes possible, we then start to play in a new world that becomes, endlessly creative and fun, and I love how happy and joyful you are right now, because I remember for me, and having an experience where I was like, wait, this is what joy feels like. Wait, this is why people are living. I feel happy, and it's like all of a sudden when you can drop all of the trauma and all of the things that are holding us back, and the judgments and the preconceived notions and, constructs that were put in place by so many for their perceived, to keep us in line or in check or whatever. And when all of those can fall away and we can be in just our natural essence, the world becomes so rich and so fun and so playful.
Absolutely playful. So when you said the 80-20, it is, because you still have to do a lot of work. It's still absolutely a transition and a transformation that you go through, so you have to somewhat work on it, but to be able to have the freedom now to work on it in a playful way, that like all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, and this was available to me the whole time.
And I think something I want to say about that is, as you're talking about it, is that when I started on my path of healing, I was in the bowels of despair and sorrow and grief and all of that. And I remembered about halfway through, I went, wait a second, who said it had to be like this? Healing doesn't have to be this painful. And it's not to say that we don't want to experience or feel the pain, but almost the pain becomes an addiction. We become addicted to, if it's not hard, it's not working. If I'm not crying or going through this massive catharsis. And now I think that we have the ability to be in absolute play and wonder, and also, feeling the gamut of our emotions, but it doesn't have to be that overwhelming heaviness that we often experience or equate to, oh, if I go into the dark or go into the shadows, then that means I also have to come through, this heaviness. And yet we can go through this process with such play and wonder, with such compassion for ourselves as we walk this new way of being.
Awesome. So help me understand then, you certainly have gone through, I'll say transformation, There's, the Trish that we are having the joy of talking to today, knowing a little bit about your life story. What is the real life transformation for you now? Or if you can paint a before and after, or that doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things, and oftentimes I get asked the question of, what if I go and do these medicines and it tells me that I need to become a monk or my entire life is going to change? I had a client the other day that was like, I'm too afraid to go do this because I desperately want to change, but what if it tells me that I've got to change all of this about myself, right? And so I think that one of the things that for me, I lived a life of believing that I had to act a certain way in order to be lovable. If I was perfect, if I was polished, and that was my family modeling. And then all of a sudden it was like, what if none of that's true and I get to be me? And lovability for myself comes in this form of my own self-expression. And I think that, it's interesting as I was reflecting on this morning, one of the things that I've often said, and I might be going, a little off the rails here, but shame often comes from the secrets that we are keeping that are keeping us sick. And I think that when we can really allow our truths to be told, I know for me, for so many years, I didn't want to speak out about my childhood. I didn't want to share what had happened because if I did, how does that affect others? And then what does that mean about me? Am I now damaged? Am I unlovable? Am I not enough? How will the world view me? And I realized that actually in speaking my truth and sharing this, and allowing myself to say me too, or be able to guide, I love the saying, we all are just walking each other home. And if we can then hold each other in this journey and allow ourselves the space to walk each other home. And I think for me, one of the most, I always had this narrative of my life was perfect. My childhood was perfect. It was all wonderful. And it was all bullshit. It was and there were aspects of it that were wonderful and it was beautiful, but I came from a very abusive, dysfunctional family. And when I could start to own that and also come into loving acceptance, and then, the final for me is to have that forgiveness. And it's not so much for forgiving those that participated in the abuse, was forgiving myself for forgetting who I was and really coming into my own self authentic expression. And it's that we abandon ourselves in all of this. And I think when we stop pointing fingers and blaming our families or blaming perpetrators, or, we become the victim. When we continue to say that we've been victimized, it's like when I can take ownership of my experience and fully align with, I am in control with how my life and destiny can become by the choices that I make today. And there's no one else responsible. No one else is in charge of this other than me. And so I think for me, that was I stopped blaming anyone. I took control. I'm in charge of who I want to become and how this manifests for me. And the world just opened up in such beautiful ways. And I did make a massive, well, not completely, but I made, some career changes and different choices for myself. And, I think the medicine does allow us this freedom to be in a different expression of who we are.
That was really beautiful. So I have one more question then, is because that was such a beautiful high note. And then what does that mean for women's leadership and for possibilities moving forward with your perspective on anything?
Yeah, I love that. Even as you asked that question, my body, I got chills. I think for me, it's a matter of when I am true to myself, when I speak my truth, and I can sit before you and allow you the same permission to speak yours, and we can meet and see each other there, we then allow this universal healing. And so, as I authentically do my work and I show up in the fullest expression of myself, and I sit before my fellow sister as I am today, and I allow you to do the same, we shift the vibrational energy universally. And so, if we can then champion each other to be the best versions of ourselves, to stand in our authentic truths, to speak with vulnerability, but also having compassion for ourselves and other, we shift the paradigm. In that alone, we shift the paradigm. And so I can't simply say what one should do in their career, how they should, should they leave their marriage or stay in their marriage or move on to, something else. But I can say that when we do our own personal work, we then shift one person at a time by those we influence and how we show up differently. And I think more than anything that each and every one of us has an internal system of knowing and heightened intuition. And it's up to us whether or not we want to be in co-creation with that voice. And I think that, I've been gifted to have very, very, my intuition is strong, my psychic abilities are strong, and yet people will come to me and say, well, I didn't get that. And I think that we all have it. It's just whether or not we choose to tap into it, and if we want to do the work to see that full expression. And I think if I could say anything to women is to not abandon yourself in anything that you're doing. And that self-care and that self-love trumps all in transforming who we are. Yeah.
Wow, right back at you with the, chills all over. That was very, very beautiful. And I couldn't, be happier just to receive that message and to be able to share that with others, because that, I believe the same thing, and it's very, very powerful. Yeah. And it all starts with each one and every one of us when we're open and when we're ready.
Yeah, when we're open and I think that's something else. I have to just say this because I know that the question will come up with your audience, as it naturally does. I often have people come to me and say, what psychedelic should I do? Or what program should I go through? My background is I got my degree in spiritual psychology, and I'm trained in several different trauma therapies now. And, often I always say that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And if you can place, I think another thing that I want to just bring into the conversation and to bring this to completion is that what we focus on, we bring about, right? And so the power of intention is so huge. And for me, I had one intention and one only, and that was to heal and find freedom in whatever form that showed up. And so I think it's important that as we seek for answers and we look for different healing modalities, to not necessarily, we can educate ourselves by asking our peers that are in this space, but I think it's also important that we listen to our internal wisdom. And when the student is ready, the teacher appears, and I promise the perfect teacher will appear. And maybe that begins with a book. Maybe that begins with a meditation that's being sent to us. Maybe it begins like myself, where I got called to go to the jungle and do the most powerful hallucinogen, my first intro into therapeutic psychedelics with iboga. And that was the teacher that I needed at the time. And so I really just encourage each and every one of us that we continue to listen to that still small voice in us and know that when we are ready, the perfect teacher will appear in whatever form that might come.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It has been an honor and an absolute pleasure. I will drop in the show notes the links that you would love to share with the audience as well. I know we can find you at followyourtruenorth.com. And if
True.
there's anything else you'd like to share with the audience, or how they can get in touch with you, or what you'd like to share with them, you can either say that now, or I can put in the show notes, so we can do it either way, or both.
Yeah, we can do both. You know, I also, as I began my healing journey, I blindly went to Africa. I now have 150 orphans in Africa, and you can find the link to that at orphansclub.org. And so I know that charitable service trips, we do a lot of those, which are so incredible. And if anyone's called to go and do work in Africa, that certainly is my heart and joy. And so incredible, my family there.
Great. Certainly, I'll include that in the show notes. Once again, thank you so much for your time. It's certainly been a pleasure talking to you, and we'll talk to you soon.
So much love.